Subscribers to The Australian hear episodes first and get access to all Shari's work on this topic, as well as unrivaled news, politics, investigations, sport and culture. Go to theaustralian.com.au/Wuhan to find out more.
I'm Shari Markson, and I've spent most of the past 2 years investigating the origins of COVID-19.
The Chinese city of Wuhan is under quarantine as the outbreak of the coronavirus worsens.
The federal government has raised its travel advice for the Chinese provinces to Wuhan and Hubei to level 4.
This is the front line of the epidemic in Wuhan, and it is bleak.
I'm declaring a public health emergency of international concern over the global outbreak of novel coronavirus.
What really happened in Wuhan?
Did you ever watch the movie The Sting?
I'm not sure.
There wasn't a con he couldn't run, and there wasn't a sucker he couldn't gaff. Robert Redford is Johnny Hooker, a young drifter with plenty of moxie.
$3,000 on the rent, Jimmy.
The old movie, it's Robert Redford's classic, and he runs a scam. And they have a whole section called The Shutout, where they refuse to take this money from this guy at a bet. Anyway, we were getting the shutout.
Mike Pompeo was Donald Trump's Secretary of State from April 2018. He's a former soldier, businessman, and Conservative congressman, and he was elected to the House in 2010 as part of the Tea Party wave. Trump believed they were on the same wavelength. Raised in California, Pompeo is straight-talking and affable. He patrolled the Iron Curtain before the fall of the Berlin Wall. He then went on to graduate from Harvard Law School. Donald Trump appointed Pompeo CIA director, a position where he had access to top-secret intelligence about the serious threat China posed to national security. Under his stewardship at the State Department, Pompeo led a monumental reset in the relationship between the United States and China. This China pivot cannot be overstated. Trump had already opened Americans' eyes to the unequal trade terms with China, but Pompeo sought to expand it beyond the economic remit to human rights, the exposure of influence operations, intellectual property theft, and China's other malign actions that sought to disadvantage America. And when the pandemic hit, Trump had just signed his historic trade deal with China. Keen to protect it, he repeatedly praised Xi Jinping for his transparency. Trump insisted to the public China was cooperating. Here's one example, comments to CNBC journalist Joe Kernan on January 22, 2020 in Davos, Switzerland.
We have it totally under control. It's one person coming in from China, and we have it under control. It's going to be just fine.
Do you trust that we're going to know everything we need to know from China?
I do. I have a great relationship with President Xi. We just signed probably the biggest deal ever made. No, I do. I think the relationship is very, very good.
But Pompeo was seriously concerned. While he was careful to never disagree with the president in public, my understanding is that Pompeo did make his views known to Trump about China's cover-up and responsibility for the global outbreak. He then quickly became aware of the activities at the Wuhan Institute of Virology. When I first interviewed Pompeo while I was writing my book, What Really Happened in Wuhan, back in May 2021, he told me about how China's refusal to accept help at this early stage rang immediate alarm bells. It made him question whether the virus had come from the wet market at all. This is why he describes the lack of cooperation from Chinese authorities as America getting the shutout.
You could see it in the formal ways,
Yes.
were through formal channels, where there were formal requests from our medical team to provide support to the Chinese as they needed, and they were, we got this, no problem. Then we'd ask for data, and we'd be told we don't have it, we're working on it. And then in informal conversations too, it became very clear. And then there was the public issues, right, with the doctors, all the things that they were shutting it down. The reason I start my answer to your question about when did we first suspect the Wuhan Institute of Virology as a potential place there could have been a leak, it began with we started thinking about what the possibilities were as soon as we realized they were going to have none of us figuring this out. It puts you on alert. It says, goodness gracious, you would think that a global response is required by the WHO rules. They want everybody in to come help them. And they wanted just the antithesis of that.
Later in 2021, I sat down with Pompeo again for another interview. Some people say that China's cover-up is par for the course for communist regimes. But Pompeo's view is that the extent of the cover-up over the coronavirus indicated a more sinister origin to COVID-19. What does China's extensive cover-up of COVID-19, from refusing health authorities in America early access to the virus samples to denying there was human-to-human transmission, what does this say to you about the origins of the virus?
Well, it says an awful lot about the origins of the virus, and you combine that with the other things that we know about the origin of the virus, and it leads to a single logical conclusion that this virus came from the Wuhan Institute of Virology, that the Chinese Communist Party knew an awful lot about this virus, and they didn't want anybody else to know about it. It's pretty clear that the continuing cover-up of what happened, we often think about this as in the past, right? It's now, goodness gracious, now 20 months on, but it's ongoing, right? They still won't let folks in. They still won't give access to the information that they have. I'm counting on some brave doctor, somebody who was working in the lab, to come send this information out to the West so that we can certainly hold accountable those responsible, but more importantly, we can do the right things to make sure something like this is unlikely to ever happen again.
It's only now that the broader community are starting to accept that a lab leak might be the real source of the outbreak for COVID-19. Secretary, what role did China play and the Chinese Communist Party play in shaping the narrative that took hold right from the start about the origins of COVID-19?
Well, Sherry, anybody who's studied communist regimes knows that they are propaganda masters, that in fact they think this is where the war gets fought. It gets fought in the information space, it gets fought with the narratives and the stories that are told. The CCP is no different from that. They told stories out of the gate. They told lies about how many people were dying in Wuhan. They told lies about the activities that take place inside and outside of the lab. They worked with the WHO to convince them to be part of their propaganda arm as well. So this was a full-on senior leader effort from the Chinese Communist Party to mask the horrors that resulted from the behavior of the Chinese Communist Party. I'm sure, Sherry, we'll get a chance to talk about this. But the other thing that the cover-up tells you is the absolute absence of humanity of these leaders. They are willing to allow people to die. They don't care about human life. They don't value them the way that people in the West, in the United States and Australia do. They are prepared to let millions of people die if that's what it takes to protect their regime.
We will come back to the WHO and its culpability in a moment. I'm interested what you think the role of the media, the scientific community, and the tech giants was in shaping this narrative that effectively sided with the Chinese propaganda line that this had to be a virus of natural origin.
That's a great question. I've actually said this a few times about specific comments. Dr. Fauci was quoted as saying, no, the Chinese have every reason to tell us what actually happened. I mean, that's just nonsense. It's deeply, deeply illogical. And he's smarter than that. There's deep connections between the American scientific community and the Chinese Communist Party's money that flows into the American scientific community. So our incentive system is askew. And we saw big media say, you know what, Donald Trump and his Secretary of State are out talking about this thing. These people are surely crazy. They're political zealots. They want a shiny object. I heard all the different stories. But of course, as we unpack it, as we accumulate data, science, evidence, facts, it's more clear than ever that the virus came from this laboratory. I can't prove it. I can't lay down a perfect record. The Chinese aren't permitting us that. I wish that I could. But I don't think anyone can stare at the data sets that are available today and not say, if I were having to bet my own money, I would have to make my own judgment about this. This is a Chinese Communist Party cover-up, an accident that came from their laboratory.
It is hard to separate, and you mentioned there, the statements that President Trump made and that you made starting from April 2020. It's hard to separate the election year from the narrative that took hold around the origins of the virus. And it's so despicable when you think of it because, you've got 4 million people who have lost their lives, but to many, the politics of not supporting something that you had said or that President Trump had said seemed more important than actually getting to the bottom of this virus.
Oh, it was true. It was a full-on media onslaught. They wanted to call me racist. They wanted to say that this was just the Pompeo as a sycophant to Donald Trump trying to cover up for failures with the response to the COVID virus. We saw all of this, and you would see it. You would see it flow from MSNBC to CNN. You'd see the entire panoply of large U.S. media outlets, and of course CNN International around the world as well, saying, well, this doesn't make any sense. Surely this was transmitted naturally, right? Saying things that were illogical. By the way, repeating things that American scientists said, that Peter Daszak had said, right? Who talked about the fact that, no, the gene splicing would be evident. All these things were just provably false, and scientists knew it. Indeed, team at the State Department had come to a very similar conclusion. I wouldn't have said it if it wasn't just me. This was our team who was looking at the data set at the time. So it's really unfortunate that we were in the middle of a big election. Political leaders decided to use this for political purposes, and our media adopted the lines from Dr. Tedros and from Xi Jinping, and not the lines that were based on science, that were put forward by thoughtful, reasoned scientific effort coming out of Dr. Redfield at CDC, Secretary Azar at HHS, the work we were doing in the State Department. That wasn't politics. It was just about data. We never said anything that we didn't know to be true. We were always careful. We were always cautious. But it was also important that we not hide behind the veneer of what the story of the day happened to be.
Getting back to the mechanics of the origins of the virus, how early do you think it started spreading in Wuhan?
So I'll leave to professionals to give the full color on this. But we put out a statement at the State Department in January that indicated that there were people working at this laboratory who demonstrated what the early COVID virus symptoms looked like in 2019 in the fall. There are other data points too. I've seen them. I'll leave to professionals to evaluate their depth and the power of those arguments. But if you were to just ask Mike what his judgment is, I think leaders inside of the CCP knew about this in the fall of 2019, and that the most senior leaders in the Chinese Communist Party knew about this by the end of 2020.
So you think President Xi Jinping might not have known about this in the fall of 2019? It might have been covered up from him?
It's possible. It's possible also that there was confusion, that there were mixed signals inside of their information apparatus. It's also the case that aren't rewarded inside of the CCP for bringing bad news to the boss. And so it's possible. I don't want to talk about the specific intelligence, but I always am careful about the things that I say I can publicly tell you with certainty. It's possible that Xi Jinping himself might not well have known about the scope and the scale, the transmissibility and the lethality of this virus until a little bit after many of his professionals inside the medical establishment, who frankly wanted to work with the United States. These people wanted to work with the CDC, the best experts in the world. In the end, the political leaders got a hold of it and prevented that from happening.
Look, the virus database of the Wuhan Institute of Virology disappeared, taken offline September 12, 2019. What does that indicate to you about the origins of the virus and whether an outbreak might have occurred or become known to the Wuhan Institute of Virology at that early date, September 2019?
Sure. So I've seen data points that place it in the summertime of 2019, late summer, July, August of 2019. Your comment about what happened to this particular database in September of that year, these are all parts of the pieces, right? This is all the cumulative weight of the evidence that suggests that it did come from this lab and that it wasn't January, it wasn't February of 2020. when senior officials surely must have known precisely what they had on their hands. And the risk of what they had on their hands presented to not only people inside their own country, but to the world.
I first reported that Wuhan Institute of Virology researchers working on coronaviruses were hospitalised with COVID-like symptoms in November 2019. Xi Zhengli strongly denied this. What can you tell us about your confidence that these workers had COVID-19 and not the flu? Did they have symptoms consistent specifically with COVID, such as loss of taste or smell?
We wouldn't have put out the statement that talked about the illnesses, the evidentiary basis to make the statement that these illnesses were consistent with a particular virus, this time COVID-19, if we didn't believe it.
Those early cluster, do you believe that to be the first cluster of the pandemic?
Based on everything I've seen, this is the first cluster. It's possible there were others. I wish the Chinese Communist Party would share that information with us if they know about it. These could have been other clusters inside of China. There could have been evidence that there were clusters someplace else. They've suggested this, right?
In fact, Chinese propaganda outlets like the Global Times have long since stopped suggesting the virus came from a wet market. Instead, they say it came from a bioweapons laboratory, but an American one called Fort Detrick.
They talk about Fort Detrick. I mean, this is just crazy talk, right? This is, and we have our media repeat these things. It's so odd that you would read the Global Times or the CGTN, right, and repeat something that these propagandists would put forward. I've seen no evidence that there's a cluster that began any place but this. I am all ears to see of any evidence that presents some fact set to the contrary.
Does this mean that patient 0 was from the Wuhan Institute of Virology?
I don't know the answer to that.
And in terms of just coming back to that question about the COVID-like symptoms, because there has been a suggestion from others, from the WHO investigator Marion Koopmans, that this might have been a cold or a flu. Were the symptoms that they suffered specific to COVID, that loss of taste and smell?
Seems patently absurd to me to suggest that a virologist at this particular laboratory would have come down with a flu that is much more common than the virus that we were speaking about, and exhibit the very symptoms that we know that they had. I don't want to go into any more detail than that, but it just seems unlikely to me.
I interviewed President Trump a couple of weeks ago, and I asked him what evidence he saw that was most convincing to him that this virus came from a lab. President Trump told me that there were body bags outside the Wuhan Institute of Virology. Is this correct?
So the president would have had access to a whole lot of information. I don't want to talk about particular things. Presidents get the chance to talk about things that some of the rest of us can't. But there was an enormous, albeit indirect, evidence that the Wuhan Institute of Virology was the center point for this. We've talked about the doctors. We've talked about the pulling down the data set that came from there. We know what happened to the professionals that were working in this laboratory too. They were silenced. We know that there's been no one permitted to actually go into the heart of the laboratory. They may have had access to the lobby to have a PowerPoint presentation from a propagandist, but they weren't given any meaningful access to the WIV. Remember too, there were 14 American diplomats on the ground in Wuhan at this time. And so while I can't go into specifics, we had a State Department team of officials that were there, both trying to determine what happened, get access to information to help, frankly, prevent this from spreading around the world. They were trying to protect themselves. We ultimately were able to get them and the other Americans out of Hubei province, out of Wuhan proper. But for the duration of this, there were American officials on the ground who were watching and observing what was taking place inside of Wuhan. I hope one day that we'll be able to get that information out more broadly, but as I come back to it, the cumulative evidence that one can see points singularly to the Wuhan Institute of Virology.
So just to clarify, have you seen intelligence that supports what President Trump said, that there were body bags dumped outside the Wuhan Institute of Virology?
Yeah, I just don't want to comment on that.
In terms of getting to the bottom of what might have specifically sparked the outbreak, as you say, there's this preponderance of evidence that there was an incident at the Wuhan Institute of Virology. But in terms of getting to the specifics about what happened that might have, whether it was an accident or a virus that leaked or an animal bite, Do we have information from defectors who were working in the Wuhan Institute of Virology?
Well, what we know is this. The Chinese Communist Party has been running these laboratories, not only this particular one, but others, in a way that doesn't meet world standards. We know, too, before that we've had precisely the kind of activity that we saw here. We saw people that were working inside the facility come down with the very symptoms of the virus upon which they were working. This isn't new to Chinese failure of being able to run biologic testing and genetic efforts inside of their laboratory. So there's a pattern in practice, there's a history. In U.S. courts, you could actually use this information oftentimes to suggest that there was inadequate capability to prevent precisely the kind of accidental leak that we've been talking about here this morning. There is a pattern of CCP negligence. There's a pattern of disregard for good order and systems. And then the cover-up. The cover-up itself is a crime, right? The fact that they didn't, whether that was in September or in November or in January, invite the world's leading experts in from across the world, not just American, but from any pocket of the world, to come in and try their best to prevent the pandemic from spreading. That's now killed millions of people, is itself recklessly negligent. And the absence of anybody having access to the logbooks, access to the data sets, access to the scientists inside the WIV points singularly in the direction of it having come from there.
Look, the WHO is just as culpable in many ways in allowing this virus to spread internationally. How beholden was the WHO and Dr. Tedros to China?
Deeply beholden. Beholden for resources. Dr. Tedros owed his leadership role at the WHO to deals that were cut with the Chinese Communist Party, right? It's a political organization where they vote for who gets to be the next leader. Dr. Tedros couldn't have been that next leader without the support of the Chinese Communist Party. And then we saw the behavior on the ground where he talked about how wonderful the Chinese Communist Party was behaving. They were doing all that they could. And we now know nothing could have been further from the truth. Again, this was the tragedy, the central tragedy of the end of 19, the beginning of 20. It became political, not scientific. It became driven by personal incentives and not the data set. We were scrambling here in the United States to try and get data to make this not political. We didn't want to aim this as a weapon against the Chinese Communist Party. We wanted to save lives across the world. And so we began to investigate. We began to do the work. We began to try and protect America. We began Operation Warp Speed. All of these things singularly aimed at protecting the loss of human life.
Do you think there should be an investigation into Dr. Tedros's ties to China?
Sure, but we already know an awful lot. The truth of the matter is the reason that I ultimately made the recommendation to the president, which he followed, to depart from the World Health Organization, was because this had lost its veneer of being a scientific, data-driven organization, had become one that was too political. Look, I get it. I come from this world. I get the fact that there are political drivers inside of every big thing. But when the moment came, when the WHO was tasked with accomplishing the singular mission with which it was intended to accomplish, preventing global pandemic and the spread thereof, they fell down. And they fell down because they weren't willing to confront the perpetrator. They weren't willing to demand from the Chinese Communist Party that they be given access. They failed. They failed because of the absence of backbone and resolve. They became political, not scientific, and the world is deeply worse off for this. And those who led that organization, Dr. Tedros and his entire team, are responsible for not having demanded that the CCP behave in a way that the CCP itself had promised it would, right? When you sign up for the WHO, you commit to a set of international health regulations. They blew through all of them, and the WHO did nothing.
Is this corruption?
Use whatever descriptor you like. They failed. They failed not only that they didn't find these answers in a timely fashion, but they failed to exert the effort and the requirements that they had as leaders. They should have turned to the Chinese Communist Party and says, no, we're not going to allow America to leave. We're going to kick you out, right? You sign up to be a member of the WHO and you make a certain set of commitments. You have not lived up to those commitments. You have 20 days to fix it. You have 20 minutes to fix it. Pick a time. But there should have been a remedy for the Chinese Communist Party's failure to comply with its promises as a member in good standing of the WHO. Instead, they didn't do that. Instead, Tedros turned the other cheek. He flew to Beijing. He kissed the ring. And sadly, you see the results today.
I mean, it is absolutely sickening to think that the WHO, charged with protecting the health of billions of people around the world, cared more about the reputation of the Chinese Communist Party than all of our health. And we can see the outcome of that, as you say. Secretary, you said last year that Tedros had been bought by China. What did you mean by this?
I mean, when he had a choice, we had the simple decision of whether to get it right or be kind to Xi Jinping. He chose the latter and not the former. The Chinese Communist Party is a big player in most international organizations around the world. We can all see this very clearly. They're using them as propaganda tools. They're using them to exert Chinese influence in the world. We can't even get the United Nations to take actions against genocide that's taking place inside of China today. So these international organizations are dependent upon China for resources and money. The WHO certainly is as well. They should do science, not politics, and they should base their decisions not on who's contributing to them, but who's on contributing to their mission.
While the World Health Organization was sprouting China's propaganda, others started digging into the Wuhan Institute of Virology. There were simultaneous discoveries around the world as scientists like Yuri Dagan and US government advisors like Matt Pottinger and Miles Yu started to closely examine the type of coronavirus research underway at the Wuhan Institute. And what they found was disturbing. The scientists in Wuhan had been conducting what's known as gain-of-function research, where viruses are genetically manipulated to make them more virulent or more transmissible. The viruses gain new functions, like the ability to infect humans or to become airborne. And this research was so risky that the Obama administration hit pause on it or banned it in 22 fields, including coronaviruses, in 2014. But what's shocking, truly shocking, is that even when this ban was in place, American funding was flowing through to the Wuhan Institute of Virology for gain-of-function research on coronaviruses. Fauci has defended funding coronavirus research in China, saying it was to avoid an outbreak in the United States. Have a listen to this.
It was incumbent upon us to study the animal-human interface and to understand what potential these viruses have of infecting humans, which then might damage the United States. So please let me finish. So you don't want to go to Hoboken, New Jersey, or to Fairfax, Virginia, to be studying the bat-human interface that might lead to an outbreak. So you go to China.
Even when the gain-of-function research was in place, American money, NIH money, was flowing through to the Wuhan Institute of Virology. It was flowing through to China. Was this appropriate?
Well, the folks who are responsible for that will have to explain precisely what they were doing. It's often the case that U.S. taxpayers are working in places to try and do good work. So I'll give you examples. We provide money to governments to make sure that their nuclear weapons are protected. So we do nuclear assurance efforts there. Those monies flow to some governments that aren't too whippy. If it were the case that we were doing this to try and make that lab more safe and more secure and reduce the risk of precisely what we saw in this pandemic, one could make the case for that. But if, in fact, that money was going to avoid U.S. regulations to try and conduct research there that we couldn't do here or couldn't do anyplace else, if this was being used as a workaround, it is entirely inappropriate. Indeed, it may well be unlawful under U.S. law.
Are you concerned at all about how it happened that the gain-of-function ban was lifted during the Trump administration? You know, I've interviewed many people and I've asked many people in the administration about this, and many of them didn't even know that the ban had been lifted until 2020 or even 2021. How was it that Anthony Fauci was able to do this without anyone knowing?
Well, I don't know for sure who all was involved in that decision-making process. I can say this much: it's not my expertise. we should be really diligent and make sure every voice is heard. We have lots of competing interests. State Department has interests, HHS has interests, others in the U.S. government, medical community, the private sector are providers who do most of the best R&D in the world, have a deep interest. When we look back and figure out how that decision was made, I hope that all of those parties were able to come to the table, express their viewpoints, their concerns, so that we had not only a decision, but an informed decision that was made. I've seen very little evidence to date that there was a broad-based information exchange before the decision was made by Dr. Fauci to lift that ban on gain-of-function research.
Organisations like the NIH were funding the Wuhan Institute through grants to an American-based not-for-profit called the EcoHealth Alliance. Its president, Peter Daszak, had been working with the Wuhan Institute's top virologist, Shizheng Li, for more than 15 years. Daszak's name is important to know in the Wuhan story because he played a critical role in forming the narrative that a lab leak was a conspiracy. Unbeknownst to the general public, he drafted and organised a letter from 27 scientists that appeared in one of the world's most prestigious scientific journals, The Lancet, in early 2020. In this letter, the scientists ruled out a laboratory leak and said the virus had a natural origin. It was far too early to make any such call, and what's more, Daszak tried to hide his role in the letter. We only found out about it from documents obtained through the Freedom of Information Act by the US Right to Know group later, months later, in November 2020. The Lancet letter also did not disclose any competing interests, no conflict of interests. What's worse is that Daszak would then later go on to be part of the WHO mission to Wuhan, examining and investigating the origins of COVID-19. Daszak also insisted in media interviews that a lab leak was a conspiracy theory. He sent 97 tweets where he used this word from July 2020 to May 2021. But most media outlets never questioned his version of events. Remember, it was an election year in the United States, and everything Trump said was treated with contempt by huge sections of the media.
It shouldn't have taken long for reporters to go ask other professionals, but they didn't ask those questions. They bought the Daszak story, right? It was simple. It was easy. By the way, it ran counter to the Trump narrative. That made them happy, right? Remember, there were these biases in place in these institutions who were reporting, and this fit their storyline, their narrative of the Trump incompetence. This fit their narrative. And so they didn't ask the question. They didn't go to people with a different vision for this. They would have clearly seen the Daszak story didn't hold up under even simple scientific scrutiny.
It wasn't just the media that resisted investigating the possibility the virus leaked from a laboratory. Even inside Pompeo's own State Department, people didn't want to believe this was possible. And some even tried to stop an investigation from taking place.
Look, we've spoken a lot about China's cover-up of this virus, but it seems to me that there was also attempts not to look into the possibility of a lab leak within the bureaucracy in the United States, even in your own Department, Secretary Pompeo, in the AVC team, Miles Yu, Tom Donano, David Asher, David Stilwell, David Feith, all operating, under your command, heroic guys, and yet they came up against some strong resistance when they were trying to investigate a lab leak. What do you make of this sort of attempts to shut down an investigation into a lab leak within the State Department?
Yeah, we were determined to get the answer, so we built out the team that you described. These are true patriots trying to get data, not to do politics. If you know any of these people, these are people deeply committed to data and science and research and facts, not to storytelling. I promise you, Secretary Pompeo said, hey, let's go tell a story, they would have kicked me out of the room, mocked me. Right? They wanted to get it right. They were met with bureaucratic resistance from inside of the United States government. The details of which I don't want to go into today, but suffice it to say there were those with a vested interest in telling the same narrative that was being told all around them, and they didn't want the controversy that flowed from the statement that I made. I think it was on I think it was on Martha Raddatz show where I first spoke about this publicly. They viewed this as political. There were those who viewed this as political, and those people that you identified viewed this as a serious effort to protect not only Americans, but to protect people all around the world.
Do you think people didn't want to consider that this was the reality because it's just something that's too big to deal with? I mean, if it turns out that a virus that has caused millions of people around the world to lose their lives did originate in a Chinese lab, I mean, the question is, what do you do about that?
I think there's some of that. I think some of that remains today. I think that people kind of want to turn away and turn the page because the fact that the Chinese Communist Party knowingly allowed a virus to travel around the world and it resulted in millions of deaths has massive repercussions for how the world must treat the Chinese Communist Party. And I think there are many vested interests, some in governments around the world, some in politically corrupt leaders around the world, some of it in the financial communities and business communities around the world, who know that if that's proven, if that's the data set, if that becomes the reality that is just, you just can't look away from it, yes, I think some of them would prefer to look away and hope that that data set doesn't come alive, because when it does, no one can contemplate how it is the case that we could ever again work with the Chinese Communist Party in a way that took seriously their commitment to protecting human life in the world.
It does appear that there were warnings about the Wuhan Institute of Virology, that things weren't quite kosher there, that were missed. There were the famous State Department cables from 2018. There was also the fact that the French were kicked out when the Level 4 lab opened in 2017. You know, are you concerned that there were these red flags that were overlooked?
I always worry about that. As the former director of the CIA, I was always worried that we were collecting information, but we weren't able to process it sufficiently timely and get that information to the right places. There are multiple missions, right? When you have information, you not only need the info and the capacity to take it in, but you need to be able to process it and get it analyzed into the decision makers. I always worried anytime I was leading an organization that I was getting this processed information. We'll have to go back and take a look to see what was known. We should also always remind ourselves that when you're dealing with the CCP, the best place to go is to the dark side, right? What do I mean by that? And there were very few times when there was uncertainty around actions that were being taken by the CCP, that when I learned of what was really going on, we were able to uncover that it would have been the happier outcome. It was almost always the one that most directly benefited and protected the Chinese Communist Party. That was certainly true with all of the information we have seen here. When they kicked out the French, we should have immediately gone on high alert and all began to ask questions about why it is they didn't want a Western set of actors inside that institute.
It's worth asking the question, while there's no doubt the Chinese Communist Party covered up the outbreak, why did it take so long for the rest of the world to find out that there was a lethal virus spreading in Wuhan? This is what intelligence agencies do. They try to work out where there are national security threats from foreign governments. It turns out there were warnings in late 2019. The father of China's democracy movement, Wei Jingsheng, found out about the virus in October 2019, and he then went on to try to alert US intelligence agencies. And you'll hear from Wei about this later in this podcast. And during David Asher's investigation into the origins of COVID-19 for the State Department, he discovered in late 2020 that crucial intelligence relating to the Wuhan Institute had been just sitting there in the possession of the US government for an entire year. Again, he tells me that in an upcoming episode, that this could have been like preventing 9/11 before it happened.
Is this a pandemic that potentially could have been prevented had the intelligence agencies paid closer attention to the information that was coming in?
This kind of work is not quintessentially of the intelligence agencies, right? There are so many touch points, right? You talked about NIH, you talked about CDC, we've talked about other. We'll have to go look back at what was actually in the possession, what was the complexity of the information, what was the certainty of that information, what were the other pieces that were in front of them. It's too simple to say, oh, they had this in their hands and therefore we could have stopped this pandemic. I have no reason to conclude that that's the case. It's also the case, sure, we can't
Should there be a review?
Sure. I think we always should go back and look at how we collected and what we knew and why it was we weren't able. That didn't send the signal up the line in the way that was would have led to a better outcome. But I want to remind everyone, it could be that we had small data points. It could be that we had fractiles of information in 2019. And you should know that from January 1st, 2020, we were shut down completely. This is not an American intelligence failure. This is a Chinese Communist Party tragedy. And so while I was a CIA director, I was always pushing my team to be better, faster, smarter, more accurate, better information. And I hope we can learn a lesson from this as well. The rise of this pandemic is directly attributable to a single government in the world, that of the Chinese Communist Party.
Look, the 90-day probe, Joe Biden's intelligence review that he ordered, has just been handed down. You know, I speak to you, Secretary Pompeo, and you talk about the overwhelming circumstantial evidence that points to a laboratory leak. Yet this intelligence probe remained divided, and some agencies are even leaning towards a natural origin, even though there's no evidence for that. You know, can you explain to us how agencies can come to that conclusion? How does this work?
Yeah, I can't account for it. I've been gone 8 months. I don't know what they might have in their possession. Maybe they have something in their possession that would convince me otherwise as well. I'm always trying to do science and data, not politics. But I just have to say, when I left in January 2020, I think I had seen all of the data sets that the United States had in its possession at that point. And I didn't see a single data set that talked about a logical pathway that could have come from a bat to a pangolin to a human that didn't involve transmission that came from the laboratory.
Long before COVID-19, Mike Pompeo was deeply concerned about China's behaviour, not just as a totalitarian communist state, but as an active foreign policy threat. Now he is sounding a chilling warning. He says China isn't just another repressive regime. To his mind, it's like dealing with the USSR or Nazi Germany.
We face a reality where the world must acknowledge that the Chinese Communist Party is a rogue regime, that is a regime that should not ever be considered to be a good actor in the international community, and it is a regime intent on global domination. I've talked about this in other contexts. We've been focused very much today on the Wuhan virus and its impact on the world. But whether it's the genocide in the West, the threats that they're posing to the people of Taiwan, the work that they're doing in Southeast Asia, indeed all around the world, to build out their Belt and Road Initiative, which is a coercive tool for them to gain power, political and otherwise, around the world. This is a regime that doesn't respect Western values. It doesn't respect human life. And it is a party that is trampling on the rights of its own people. This requires a real response, like the one that the world gathered together to do when we confronted the Soviet Union and when we confronted what happened in the 1930s in Germany. This will require that kind of global response. The pandemic and the actions that they took there, I think, were a flare, a signal to the world of the regime that sits in Beijing today and its intentions for how it will treat its own people and the rest of us as well.
What Really Happened in Wuhan is presented by The Australian. It's written and produced by me, Shari Markson, and The Australian's editorial director, Claire Harvey. It was produced by Leah Samaglu. My book, What Really Happened in Wuhan, is available online at Amazon, in bookstores in Australia at Dimox, or wherever you buy your books.